The phone booth on 125th Street had been ringing for exactly 30 seconds. Every major crime boss in America was getting dressed for Frank Costello's funeral, the event of the decade. FBI surveillance teams were positioned for blocks, cameras ready to photograph the entire mafia hierarchy in one place. But the man answering that payphone was about to make them all disappear. Not with bullets, not with bombs, with 6 words that would turn the most important funeral in mob history into the greatest no-show of all time. February 18, 1961. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was dead. Heart attack in his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. For 30 years, Costello had been the diplomatic brain behind organized crime in America. He didn't settle disputes with violence. He settled them with conversation, with influence, with the kind of political connections that made judges nervous and prosecutors transfer to other districts. His funeral was going to be the social event of the criminal calendar. Every Don from Boston to Los Angeles had reserved flights to New York. The Genovese family was hosting, naturally. Vito Genovese himself would deliver the eulogy. Carlo Gambino was flying in from Florida. Albert Anastasia had canceled 3 meetings. Even old-timers who rarely left their neighborhoods were making the trip. But the funeral wasn't just important to the mob. To the FBI, it was Christmas morning. For years, federal agents had struggled to understand the structure of organized crime. Who reported to whom? Which families were allied? Which were at war? Individual surveillance was difficult and expensive. Wiretaps caught fragments of conversations. Informants provided pieces of a puzzle that seemed to have 1,000 parts. Frank Costello's funeral would solve everything in one afternoon. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had personally approved the operation. Codename, Final Portrait. 300 agents were assigned. Telephoto lenses were positioned on rooftops 6 blocks from St. Patrick's Cathedral. Undercover agents posed as mourners, reporters, even flower delivery men. License plate readers were installed on every approach route. The plan was perfect. By the end of the day, the FBI would have a complete organizational chart of American organized crime. Photos of every major figure, documentation of who sat with whom, who spoke to whom, who showed respect to whom. It would be the intelligence coup of the century. There was just one problem. Nobody had asked Bumpy Johnson for permission. Bumpy Johnson, at 54, was not technically part of the Italian mafia. He was something more dangerous, an independent operator who commanded more respect in his territory than most dons commanded in theirs. Harlem was his kingdom, and everyone who wanted to do business there, legal or illegal, paid him tribute. But Bumpy's power extended far beyond Harlem's borders. He had information, secrets, the kind of knowledge that could destroy careers, marriages, and lives. For decades, he'd been collecting debts that weren't financial, favors owed, embarrassments hidden, weaknesses exploited. Most gangsters ruled through fear of violence. Bumpy ruled through fear of exposure. 3 days before Costello's funeral, Bumpy received an unusual visitor. Father Michael Torino, a priest from St. Bartholomew's Church in Little Italy. Father Torino wasn't there for spiritual guidance. He was there because someone needed to deliver a message, and a priest could go places where other messengers might not survive. "They want to know if you're coming to Frank's funeral," Father Torino said, sitting in Bumpy's office above Small's Paradise. Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He was reading the newspaper, specifically the obituary section. Frank Costello's death notice took up half a page. It listed his business interests: construction, waste management, labor consultation. It mentioned his charitable contributions to Italian-American organizations. It described him as a devoted husband and community leader. "Tell them I'll be there in spirit," Bumpy said finally. Father Torino shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Johnson, I think they were hoping for a more definitive answer." Bumpy folded his newspaper and looked at the priest directly. "Father, you ever wonder why Frank Costello lived as long as he did in this business? I suppose he was careful. He was smart enough to know that some people you don't invite to parties, and some people you don't uninvite." Bumpy stood up and walked to his office window, looking down at Lenox Avenue. The question isn't whether I'm coming to Frank's funeral. The question is whether anyone else will be." The priest left confused. He delivered Bumpy's cryptic message to Vito Genovese, who dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Let the man stay in Harlem," Genovese said. "This is family business." That was Genovese's first mistake. His second was underestimating what Bumpy Johnson did with the next 72 hours. Bumpy Johnson didn't employ traditional intelligence networks. He didn't have soldiers stationed in every city or informants in every organization. Instead, he had something more valuable: service workers, the people nobody noticed, porters and shoeshine boys, waiters and cleaning ladies, chauffeurs and telephone operators. They were everywhere. They heard everything. They reported everything. And they were invisible to men who thought power meant wearing expensive suits and eating at exclusive restaurants. Within 24 hours of his conversation with Father Torino, Bumpy had information on every major figure planning to attend Costello's funeral. Not public information, private information, secret information, dangerous information. Carlo Gambino was planning to attend the funeral, but he was also planning to meet secretly with Chicago outfit representatives afterward. The topic of discussion? How to eliminate Vito Genovese and take over his family operations. Gambino thought this meeting was completely secure. He was wrong. Albert Anastasia had been having an affair with his lieutenant's wife for 6 months. The lieutenant didn't know. Anastasia's wife didn't know. But Bumpy knew because the hotel maid who cleaned their weekly rendezvous room owed her job to a favor Bumpy had done her family 3 years earlier. Tommy Lucchese was planning to attend Costello's funeral wearing a wire for the FBI. In exchange for providing information about funeral attendees and conversations, the federal government had agreed to drop tax evasion charges against his brother-in-law. Lucchese thought this arrangement was between him and 2 FBI agents. He didn't know that one of those agents was feeding information to Bumpy through a network of compromised law enforcement contacts. Every major crime figure planning to attend Frank Costello's funeral had a secret, and Bumpy Johnson knew all of them. But information was useless without leverage. Bumpy needed a delivery system that would maximize impact and minimize risk. He needed to demonstrate his knowledge without exposing his sources. He needed to make his threats without making them sound like threats. He needed theater. February 18th, 1961, 9:47 a.m., 20 minutes before Frank Costello's funeral was scheduled to begin, Bumpy Johnson stepped into a phone booth on the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, the same phone booth he'd used for important calls for 15 years, the one where he'd negotiated truces, ordered hits, and settled disputes worth millions of dollars. He placed his first call to Carlo Gambino's private residence in Brooklyn. Gambino was probably adjusting his black tie, preparing for the short drive to Manhattan. When he answered, his voice was formal, careful. "Mr. Gambino," Bumpy said quietly, "this is Bumpy Johnson." "Mr. Johnson, I didn't expect to hear from you today. I wanted to let you know that your meeting with the Chicago representatives after the funeral has been canceled." Silence on the line. Long, heavy silence. "I don't know what you're talking about." Room 412 at the Waldorf Astoria, 2 o'clock this afternoon. The meeting where you plan to discuss removing Vito Genovese from power and redistributing his operations among the other families. Bumpy's voice remained calm, conversational. "That meeting isn't happening." More silence. "The room reservation has been canceled. The Chicago representatives have received word that you're indisposed, and if you'd like to avoid an awkward conversation with Mr. Genovese about your intentions, I suggest you find something else to do this afternoon, like staying home." The line went dead. Bumpy's second call went to Albert Anastasia's penthouse on the Upper East Side. "Mr. Anastasia," Bumpy said when the gravelly voice answered. "Bumpy Johnson." "What do you want, Bumpy?" "I want to remind you that Mrs. Patricia Torino thinks her husband is working late every Thursday evening. She doesn't know he's actually meeting you at the Excelsior Hotel on West 81st Street. She doesn't know about the apartment you've been paying for, or the jewelry, or the vacation you're planning to Atlantic City next month." Anastasia's breathing became audible over the phone. "But she could know," Bumpy continued. "In fact, she could know this afternoon, right around the time you're supposed to be paying your respects to Frank Costello. Or you could decide that today is a good day to stay home and reflect on the importance of family loyalty." Another deadline. Tommy Lucchese's phone rang while he was testing the small recording device taped to his chest. The FBI agents who'd equipped him had assured him it was undetectable. They'd also assured him that his cooperation would remain completely confidential. "Mr. Lucchese," Bumpy said, "I understand you're wearing some interesting jewelry today." Lucchese nearly dropped the phone. "I think Agent Morrison and Agent Sullivan should know that their confidential informant isn't quite as confidential as they thought. I also think you should know that wearing recording equipment to a mafia funeral is the kind of decision that tends to have permanent consequences." Bumpy paused, letting that sink in. "The good news is that you have a choice. You can take off the wire, stay home, and continue your profitable relationship with federal law enforcement. Or you can go to that funeral and explain to Vito Genovese why you're carrying FBI equipment into a room full of people who don't appreciate government surveillance." For the next hour, Bumpy Johnson made 17 phone calls, 17 conversations with men who thought they were untouchable, who believed their secrets were safe, who assumed their power protected them from consequences. By 10:30 a.m., every major organized crime figure on the East Coast had received the same message, tailored to their specific vulnerabilities: attend Frank Costello's funeral and face exposure of their most damaging secrets, or stay home and live to scheme another day. At St. Patrick's Cathedral, FBI agents checked their equipment one final time. Telephoto lenses were focused. Recording devices were activated. 300 federal agents prepared to document the gathering of the century. The funeral was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. By 10:15, only a handful of mourners had arrived, mostly legitimate businessmen who'd known Costello's public persona, elderly relatives who knew nothing about his criminal activities, and a few neighborhood friends who were genuinely there to pay respects. The FBI agents waited. The major figures always arrived fashionably late to these events. Genovese would make an entrance. Gambino would arrive with appropriate ceremony. Anastasia would command attention simply by walking into the room. 10:30 a.m. Still no major crime figures. 10:45 a.m. The FBI agents began checking their communications equipment. Maybe there was a schedule change. Maybe the funeral had been moved. 11 hours a.m. Panic set in at FBI headquarters. 300 agents, months of planning, and the most elaborate surveillance operation in Bureau history was documenting a nearly empty funeral. At 11:30, Vito Genovese finally arrived, looking confused and angry. He found a cathedral with perhaps 50 mourners, most of whom he didn't recognize. No dons, no capos, no family representation from other cities. Frank Costello, the most connected man in organized crime, was being buried with less ceremony than a small-time bookmaker. The FBI's final portrait operation captured plenty of photographs, pictures of empty pews, images of vacant seats, documentation of the most embarrassing no-show in criminal history. That afternoon, emergency meetings were called in crime families across the country. Bosses who'd planned to attend the funeral tried to explain why they'd suddenly changed their minds. Excuses ranged from sudden illnesses to family emergencies to business crises that required immediate attention. But in the private conversations that followed, the real story emerged. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated something that terrified them more than federal prosecution or rival family attacks. He'd proven that he knew enough to destroy any of them, individually whenever he chose. The funeral that was supposed to showcase the power and unity of organized crime instead revealed something much more dangerous, that a single man with the right information could make the entire criminal hierarchy disappear with nothing more than a telephone. 3 weeks after Frank Costello's funeral, representatives from 5 families requested a meeting with Bumpy Johnson, not to threaten him, not to negotiate territory or tribute, to ask very politely what he wanted in exchange for their continued privacy. Bumpy's answer was simple: respect Harlem's independence, and he'd respect their business. Cross him, and they'd learn what happened to men who underestimated the power of information. For the next 7 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, not a single organized crime family attempted to operate in Harlem without his explicit permission. Frank Costello's funeral became a legend in criminal circles, not for who was there, but for who wasn't. The day the most powerful gangsters in America were afraid to leave their houses because one man with a telephone had reminded them that secrets are more dangerous than bullets. And the FBI learned something too. Sometimes the most successful operation is the one where nothing happens at all.